Hello, welcome to Freedom to Learn, Education Reform as part of the Youth Decarceration Movement, part of a series of live events presented by the National Center for Youth Law. We are delighted to have today's discussion moderated by our own Stephanie Horwitz, Equal Justice Fellow. Stephanie's Equal Justice Works Fellowship is sponsored by the Morrison and Forster Foundation. Stephanie, welcome, and thank you for moderating today's discussion.
Thank you so much, Patty, and thank you to everyone joining us today. As Patty said, my name is Stephanie Horwitz. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm so excited to be here with you all. Today, we will talk about the complicated issues surrounding the educational needs of youth who are incarcerated. This is a topic that intersects both school-to-prison pipeline work and juvenile justice reform, but can be overlooked in both those spaces. Often, education reform addresses the quality of education in traditional school settings with a goal of keeping kids out of jails or prisons, but doesn't necessarily focus on school programming within juvenile detention centers themselves. Similarly, juvenile justice reform may focus on improving conditions of confinement or ending confinement altogether, but doesn't necessarily target the quality of schooling within detention centers. But this is an issue that shouldn't be overlooked because for as long as young people continue to be incarcerated, there will need to be educational programs within incarcerated settings. And often, educational programming makes up a core part of the overall experience of a young person who's incarcerated. These are issues that I care deeply about on a personal level. Before becoming an attorney, I was a special ed teacher and administrator for nearly a decade. I taught in both traditional school settings and with young adults in the San Francisco County jail system. My time working in the jails in particular really underscored for me how intertwined education and criminal justice issues are. And I decided to become an attorney to push for systemic change in both areas. And now through my work at NCYL, I'm part of the Education Justice Coalition, which advocates for the educational rights of incarcerated young people who are being educated within the Los Angeles County juvenile court schools. Our coalition believes that youth incarceration is inherently harmful and should be abolished. But so long as there are youth in incarceration, they deserve to have robust educational programming that supports their future and their transition back to the community. I'm so excited to be joined by three panelists today to discuss how education reform fits into the broader youth decarceration movement. Today, we will hear from Oswaldo Lira, youth advocate and alumnus of the Our True Colors Reentry Program at the Arts for Healing and Justice Network in Los Angeles, Belle, senior staff attorney with the School Justice Project in Washington, D.C., and Kate Burdick, senior attorney at the Juvenile Law Center in Philadelphia. Thanks so much to all of you for joining us today. I'd like to dive right in. And Oswaldo, I'd love to hear from you first and ask, what do you think people need to know about the educational experience for youth who are incarcerated?
Hello, everyone. My name is Oswaldo Lira. I'm a youth leader from AHJN. My pronouns are he and his, and I feel like they should have more teachers that actually care about actually trying to teach the youth in there, especially like people incarcerated. Like they just see them as a mistake to society. Like they did whatever they did to get in here, but that doesn't mean that they should have less education just because wherever they at. And I don't know. I just believe that our incarceration people could have better education. There's so much money going to juvenile or incarceration people. I'm pretty sure they should have enough money to teach them how to do stuff in society when they come out, prepare them for life, not just take them out there so they could come back in again.
Yeah, Kate or Teo, do you have any reflections on that you'd like to build on?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I couldn't agree more with Oswaldo, particularly when it comes to the funding piece. It's so important that we not only talk about, correctional education, as a lot of us often like to call it, but also what happens when folks come home. All of these young kids, all of these older kids, they're coming right back to our communities. So investing in them is so critical. It's a major piece of the puzzle. And until we kind of get that piece together, it's not going to be a comprehensive, the type of comprehensive reformation that we're hoping to see.
Yeah, thank you so much, Oswaldo. I think also what you said about having enough teachers, having certified teachers, that really tracks across the country. Unfortunately, we're seeing, that there are staff shortages. There are also lack of certified teachers. And this is a situation where we need to be having teachers who make a connection and actually want to be there. And when there are teachers who are passionate about working with young people in confinement settings, there is real progress that can happen. And I think everyone who's gone to school knows that having a teacher that you feel strongly about can make the difference or not in how connected you feel to your education and whether you want to show up to school every day. And having that be the case in all settings is extremely important.
Yeah, absolutely. That really resonates with me, especially as a former teacher. So you've all touched a little bit upon this, talking about finances, staffing shortages. I'm just curious, and I'd love to hear from Teo first. Why is it so hard for incarcerated youth to get access to a full education in a detention setting? What are the specific barriers that are keeping this from happening?
Yeah, that's a great question, Stephanie. And I should say, thank you so much to Nicole for having me here today. So really the barriers, as we like to talk about them in our office, they abound, right? They start with the lack of the school systems or the LEAs, oftentimes the local educational agencies providing services, or as Kate mentioned, and as Oswaldo mentioned, the teaching staff, the required teaching staff for students with disabilities related services. All of these things are required as per federal and local laws. But, oftentimes for the students who are incarcerated, they're a forgotten about population. And because they're not, oftentimes out in the community, it's so much harder for them to have their rights vindicated and have their voices uplifted. There's also a lack of, what we see a lot here in Washington, D.C. is a lack of interagency cooperation. So, for instance, there's many different entities, oftentimes with just about any jurisdiction across the country dealing with correctional education, that go into providing that education. So it's not just the school system responsible for providing the education. It's often the Juvenile Justice Agency responsible for providing the education locally. Oftentimes the SEA, the State Educational Agency, they have a supervision and monitoring responsibility for students with special education needs, but also for general education students to ensure they're receiving the education they're entitled to. And oftentimes when those folks just don't talk, then our young people are the ones who are left behind. We've also seen a lack of technology, especially in this moment. The digital divide has grown. We've really seen it, expanding from the students, prior to the pandemic. Many families that we work with anyway didn't have access to, computers, laptops, internet hubs. But what we've seen during the pandemic is that issue, despite having kind of narrowed in the community, has only widened for our incarcerated students, where students just don't have access to the basics that they would need in order to access education outside of the secure facility. And also apathy. Right. We see time and again, folks in government oftentimes just saying, these are the kids that, have done something, so they don't deserve X, Y, or Z. They don't deserve access to an education. And even obviously when that's not said, it's implied. And, there's nothing more heartbreaking, I think, for me, to see kind of that level of apathy occur, where the government folks who are responsible for providing this education just aren't taking that extra step. And sometimes that's all it is just one extra step, just one extra email, one extra phone call that you have to pick up and make in order to say, hey, how can we actually bridge this gap that's happening, that's not allowing Teo, let's say, to learn.
Sorry. Thank you, Teo. I have so much to add based on that. And yes, I think let it be said, all youth want to learn, but there are these structural barriers that get put up that make it nearly impossible for youth to reach their goals. I first want to just also contextualize the settings in which we're having this conversation. We're expecting youth to show up and go to class and do their best learning when they might have just been violently restrained by a staff member right before class. They might have actually been forced to miss class yesterday and been put in solitary confinement or otherwise separated from the classroom for some unrelated reason. There's all kinds of extreme harms that happen inside facilities on top of just the trauma of being separated as a teenager from your home, from your family, from your community, your other supportive structures. So all of that is the backdrop of then let's saying, oh, and go to class and do your best work. And I think on top of a lot of the things that Teo was talking about, all of this really comes to a head and becomes painfully apparent when young people are trying to come back to school from having been in a juvenile facility of some kind. And it becomes painfully apparent that their classes their courses might not actually translate in the way that they were expecting. So maybe there's actually delay in even coming back to school in the first place and getting re-enrolled properly, and all kinds of work that's put on the youth or their families to do the groundwork to figure out where they're going to go. Oftentimes young people are pushed into alternative schools that maybe are not actually appropriate for them or are not their choice for where they would go to school. They might not be in the right courses because maybe their records didn't transfer. We don't know what course they're supposed to be in now. For students with disabilities who are receiving special education services, they might not be getting the IEP services and special ed supports that they are supposed to be. That is often not a seamless transfer, even though it's supposed to be under the law. And one area that partners and I have worked a lot on is the credit issue, not getting academic credit when you come back. I know School Justice Project has been working on that for years as well. Juvenile Law Center did a report a few years ago with Education Law Center, Southern Poverty Law Center, and Drexel University looking at this nationwide, found it to be extremely pervasive. And there are a lot of big barriers that we see across the country popping up that make this so problematic for young people, that they do everything that's asked from them inside a facility. They show up, they do the work, they think they're coming back, they think they're in 10th grade, 11th grade, 12th grade, and they're told, actually, you're in this much lower grade because none of this counts. And I think, a big part of it does have to do with some of the things Teo was mentioning in terms of lack of interagency cooperation. There's, in far too few places, there is, we're not seeing the kind of infrastructural staff support to be assisting with the reentry planning and transition process. So then again, it just leaves it to the young person and their families to be trying to navigate where are my records? How is this documented? Where do I bring this inside the school district to even know how this is going to get transferred? We also see that even when everything is perfectly documented, because of a frequent lack of quality inside the facilities, they're not necessarily offering courses that are even eligible for credit. Back to Oswaldo's point from the beginning, they may not have certified teachers teaching the courses, and then the receiving school district's like, well, we can't give you credit for that because it's not taught by a certified teacher.
Thank you so much, Kate. I wanted to give Oswaldo a chance to comment. In your work working with formerly incarcerated youth, Oswaldo, does this resonate, these challenges? Are you hearing similar experiences? Do the people that you work with, do they feel left behind in these systems?
Yeah, I mean, I was like that when I was in in those type of situations. I thought I was gonna come out and graduate in time, but when I talked to my counselor stuff in there, like they told me that I was on track, everything was good, but soon to come out. Like when I came out, like I was what I thought I was a 12th grader. I was in 11th grade. I didn't get all my credits, so that was a little bummer because I couldn't graduate with my with my class I was supposed to. And to the teachers too, like I think if you're teaching, it shouldn't matter like from a teacher out here in high school. Like if you're still in there getting that same education, it should count in all the ways. And it's a little harder to get education in there too because like you could be in class and something could happen. It's like for example, if a fight breaks down, like you have to go back to your room. So they cancel class. So I think that's not really fair for the people that really want to learn and really like actually try to make something from themselves.
Yeah, that's really disheartening, Oswaldo, and I'm so sorry that happened to you. I appreciate you sharing that. And I just want to note, we're all, Oswaldo and I are in LA, you two are both in other cities across the country, and these circumstances, I feel, are the same, which is disheartening in a lot of ways. And one point I wanted to uplift, the Education Justice Coalition that I'm a part of that I spoke about earlier formed during the pandemic when traditional school districts were mobilizing to get their kids online and access to laptops and things like that. And we realized here in LA, kids who were incarcerated, they didn't even have Wi-Fi. They weren't getting any education at all. And so it really started because the effort that was going in was, minimal to nothing to respond compared to how students out in the community were being treated. And one thing I've really been thinking about, especially through my work in the coalition, we work a lot in decarceration spaces, as I mentioned, and I know a lot of people feel that we shouldn't be working on improving programs within detention systems that shouldn't exist in the first place. So I'm curious what you all think, and I'd love to hear from Kate first. How do you see education in incarcerated settings aligning with the overall movement to end decarceration of young people?
Thanks, Stephanie. This is something I've definitely been thinking about a lot lately because, of course, young people who are currently in the system, we absolutely have an obligation to be providing them a meaningful, humane, world-class education. We've removed them from their homes and communities and are putting them in this setting, ironically, often because of things that happen at school. And so I firmly believe that when young people are there, we need to give them the full array of services that they deserve and are entitled to. At the same time, that this is all within the context of an inherently flawed and harmful system that is truly beyond repair to the point that it should be abolished. And so as advocates trying to figure out how to walk that line it's a tricky one. But I do think it's something where we always point out that education is not going to happen in a truly meaningful way inside a facility. And if we really want to be improving education for young people, getting them out of these harmful settings and making sure that communities are well resourced is the path to follow. I could talk about this at length, but I definitely want to let other people also weigh in. So feel free to circle back to me.
Thank you. Yeah, I would love to hear from Teo.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. So, one of the major components of our work at School Justice Project is really kind of advocating for our clients in court hearings. And the way that ties in is because we have this, theory that education can be a tool to help kind of end mass incarceration, particularly for the young people that we serve here in DC. So DC's a little odd in that we actually have a unique right to for young people to have a special education attorney in the family court setting. That doesn't extend to the adult criminal court just yet, but we're working on it. More to come, hopefully, the next time Nicola invites us back to speak. But what this means is that young people in DC's family court who are facing, juvenile justice proceedings are able to have a special education attorney with them throughout their court proceedings if they have special education needs. And we use the education arguments as kind of a mitigation tool to help young people in the court to, one, understand that, the young person is working towards something kind of like Oswaldo was mentioning earlier, this kind of notion of, rehabilitation. Education is a lifelong tool that the young person will be able to use, and that they, would actually be on their way to, becoming a productive grown-up. Right. And so when we're thinking about ways in which, we can be kind of assisting in the kind of movement to end the detention of young people, we think that this is one of the best ways that we're able to do it with our skill set as attorneys. While I certainly understand, folks that kind of are more in the abolition camp, and, we certainly share those viewpoints. Of course, we don't believe any young people should be in cages, period, full stop. But while they are, we want to ensure that they are getting access to what they're legally entitled to. And so for us, that really kind of shines through in our court advocacy, which does actually help mitigate the consequences of, some of the situations that the young people are facing. And so, we've seen time and again that our judges here in DC anyway, who were also instrumental in ensuring that those young people could be provided with a special education attorney. They do listen. Their ears are open to those arguments. It doesn't mean the result that we want every time. Obviously, I still have a job doing this. Unfortunately, I wish we could work ourselves out of a job, but it does make a difference. We are seeing a difference. And I'll also note briefly that during the height of the pandemic, we saw the education arguments making, having a pretty big impact on the decarceration efforts that were happening at our short-term and long-term youth detention centers. I don't know that it's fair to say that the education arguments were, the sole reason. Obviously, we had a crisis of, on the scale that we've never seen before, obviously, on our hands. But it was certainly, a component of the evaluation that the district took into consideration when they were thinking about which young people would be eligible for release under that program.
Thank you so much for your comments on that complex question. It's definitely something that I think about a lot, and I also hope to one day work myself out of a job. We have a question coming in from the audience. Thank you so much for asking. Do we know the percentage of incarcerated youth who failed to graduate from high school on time because of these issues that were discussed around incarceration? I will open that up to anyone who has the answer. Kate, thank you.
So like all data, it depends a little bit on where you're measuring, but largely it's estimated that 2 out of 3 young people disconnect from school after being involved in the juvenile justice system or a juvenile justice facility due to all of these barriers that are put up that make it so difficult to re-engage. And there's a 2019 fact sheet from OJJDP that has a summary of some of that data where I'm pulling that estimate from.
Thank you. 2 out of 3 is a hard number to hear. And I think we've talked about a lot of heavy issues so far. And I'm wondering, and I would love to hear from Oswaldo first, given all of these challenges that we've been talking about, what are you seeing that gives you hope that conditions will improve for these young people in incarceration?
Changes. Like I slowly but surely there's being changes made, and as you know, that's something good, especially incarcerated. But I wouldn't know how to say it that much. Would you be able to like rephrase that question?
I guess, in your local advocacy or your work with young people, what are the things that are inspiring you that these changes will continue?
Oh, that we're having more resources, that's for sure. More resources that are coming in, budgeting is being handled right, and they're giving people they're giving people hope to do something in their lives pretty much, while these type of programs that's coming in.
That's great to hear. What about you, Kate? What gives you hope?
So two things. One is I am hopeful and appreciative of all the young people and young adults who have lived these facilities and are speaking out to make changes around them. I specifically want to uplift a publication called Operation Education that the youth advocates at Juvenile Law Center put out a few years ago that makes recommendations specifically around this exact issue, educational reentry, and on both the juvenile justice and child welfare side of things, actually. So that's one thing. I also think that the growing movement to abolish these systems, to decarcerate, is hugely hopeful. And I think so that is the case, not just because of young people coming out of these harmful settings and out of the harmful system overall, which is of course a benefit, but also I think you can really see it in the context of education, where because young people are coming closer to home, for example, and being served in smaller facilities as a step towards ultimate abolition, that actually provides continuity with education that avoids some of the barriers that we were talking about earlier. So New York City, for example, has made more progress than many jurisdictions in the academic credit transfer issue and some of the other reentry issues, in part because they've been able to decrease the number of youth that they're incarcerating and bring them into smaller facilities inside the school district where they were attending before. So it just makes it easier. So I think in terms of globally, that decarceration movement is something to be optimistic about overall for reducing harm and uplifting young people, but also you can see it play out specifically in the education context as well.
Yeah, I would say that, one thing that gives me a lot of optimism is just the work being done by advocates in this space, which includes a lot of the young people. We've seen really in the legal sphere anyway, we've seen a couple cases coming out of this work. So for instance, colleagues in New Jersey brought a case called Adam X versus the New Jersey Correctional Institutions, which were really started because they were seeing young people who were in restricted housing settings or in isolation, really, oftentimes for minor disciplinary infractions, which in the correctional context become so much larger types of offenses, which leave young people who really are still in such a development phase in their life in isolation, which is extremely harmful to them in their development. We saw them kind of going through that case and also settling that case with a high degree of success, I would say. I believe last year, towards like I want to say the end of last year, but in any case, there have been tremendous wins on the legal landscape. Our organization, along with the Washington Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights and the public interest law firm Terrorist Proudlick and Millian, filed a class action lawsuit challenging the pandemic education conditions in our adult facility, which still has an obligation to provide special education to older court-involved students, so those who are 18 through 22 in our jurisdiction. In other jurisdictions, it can be 21, who are still entitled to special education and supports. And since we filed our lawsuit back in April of 2021, we have won our preliminary injunction against the district. We filed a contempt motion when the district still failed to provide the education that the students were entitled to. We won that. And at this point, we're receiving individualized plans for students to help try to make up for some of the time that they've lost, the instructional hours they've lost, provide for accelerated learning opportunities, et cetera, that can help the students kind of catch up to where they should have been as the judge ordered. It's still in progress, so more to come on that suit. But it's hopeful, I think, to see that at least in the courtrooms, we're seeing tremendous wins, and that can be instrumental. Just like the Adavex case was instrumental to us and our understanding of kind of where the jurisprudence is at this moment. Hopefully, our class action will be instrumental to another jurisdiction. Et cetera. And hopefully it will be a bit of a domino effect. I mean, really, young people we work with anyway, have just been so critical in our understanding of their day-to-day, experiences, and trying to let us understand, kind of what they're missing and why it's so important to them that they receive an education. I had one young man, if I can for a second, he moved from between 3 facilities during the time of the pandemic. He started at the long-term secure detention facility here in DC, moved to the short-term secure detention facility. And then when he turned 18, he moved to the jail. And at each of those facilities, there were varying degrees of education provided, despite essentially the same providers being involved in all 3 situations. But he said that, at the first place, it was like, kind of being like a rich person. And at the second place, it was kind of being like, a middle-class person. And at the third place, it was just the jail, which we brought the suit on behalf of. He said it was just like, just like being a poor person, like nobody cares about you at all. Like they don't even listen to you at all. And it was so stark just to see his experiences and how this facility, just changing facility in the same city and with the same government entities changed his experiences so much. So, again, that's just a matter of interagency cooperation, folks learning lessons from each other of what the gold standard should be, folks looking across the country, like the wonderful work that, my colleague Kate at the Juvenile Law Center does, and just saying, okay, well, we can do this. This actually isn't as big of a hurdle as we seem to think it is. We can make this happen for these young people.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm definitely feeling some hope hearing from you all. And Teo, I appreciate you sharing that personal story from the young person. We have one more question from the audience. Audience member is asking, what can schools do to support youth once they leave juvenile facilities? So to support their transition back to the community, what can the community schools do? And Oswaldo, I would love to start with you again and just hear if you have any ideas from the kinds of programming that your organization, the Arts for Healing and Justice Network, does, anything that you can think of that might help schools support these young people coming back into the community.
For sure to check on them, because going in that situation in that area and coming out to like just regular living, like most people lose track. So for sure to just check on them, have like I guess a counseling, like help them out with counseling and all that stuff. That's for sure. And I'll probably just say that, just, to really make sure they're good and make sure that they really have the education that they really want to learn.
Thank you. Is there any specific programming, by the way, Oswaldo, that Arts for Healing and Justice Network offers to support young people? I know it's not within schools, but
yeah, there's some. I've done some internships with Fabian. He's a great artist. I'm not sure if someone heard him. Fabian Dobora. He has an art studio, and he actually he changed his whole life. He told me stories about him, about how he almost killed himself, and how art changed him. And now he's a successful artist and sells paintings for a high price. And I think that was a great mentor that I had, because when I was in the internship, he really, it wasn't just a job. It was like a person. It was like, honestly, like a friend to talk to, because he's very wise and he gave me a lot of wisdom and like really to slow down in life and really appreciate the things I had. So I feel like that really got me something into it. And there's obviously Jeff Guitars. I've done that before, and that's a good program too, because like I like playing instruments. I feel like when I play instruments, it's like my best way to express myself through music. And most people do it through art. So I think that's a great experience, because most people find their way through art or music, and they don't even know it. You just gotta like help them out and realize stuff.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think that's just a really good illustration of how programming and arts programming especially can really support young people both in the community and within detention centers. So I appreciate you sharing that. Teo, I'd love to hear from you as far as any supports that you think community schools can provide young people transitioning back in.
Yeah, I actually just wanted to uplift a point that both Oswaldo and Kate made earlier, which is the credits issue. We see this a lot here in DC as well, and in our surrounding jurisdictions. I have clients tell me all the time, especially when we're at the end of the year, like now, Miss Teo, are my credits going to count? Because if not, I'm not going to this class anymore. I'm not doing this school thing anymore, right? Because of course, none of us, right? No, can you imagine going to work and then your employer is just like, no, we're not going to pay you, right? Like that's ludicrous, right? What community schools can do to support students is have proper reentry coordination. That starts with students meeting with the school team at the facility, and it ends with schools meeting with the student when they enter or re-enter their community school or whatever school it is that they're going to upon their return. That means that the teachers and the adults and the administrators are the ones that are schlepping the records back and forth to make sure that the credits are counted, that there's a transcript analysis that's conducted, that everyone is aware of what the student took while they were detained and what they passed, what they earned credit in, and making sure that the records are appropriately updated to reflect those things. I'm talking about a meeting. Really, again, these are small efforts that every school, despite, schools having a lot on their plates, but every school has the capacity to do this, and they just need to make it a priority.
I 100% agree with that. We're actually in the process of implementing a bill in Pennsylvania that just passed that requires that. Yay. And to bridge, I think, from what Teo was saying to what Oswaldo was saying too, yes, like at a minimum, let's have this meeting. Let's make sure we're welcoming you back to the school, connecting you to the right courses, making sure your records are accurate, that you know what you need to graduate, that we're giving you credit, all those things. And then, as Oswaldo was saying, stay in touch, check in. How'd the first week go? We hear that from our youth advocates all the time, that, they want that warm handoff and welcome back to the school. And they, of course, at a minimum, want to make sure that they know where they're supposed to go and all of those administrative things are in place. But then they also want to know that someone cares. And if they're having some issue, that there's someone to go to tomorrow, next week, next month. And these are simple things that schools can do with their current level of staffing, just by being there for students who they know are having a transition right now.
And if I can add very briefly, special thanks to Kate for all of her support as JP has been working with folks here in the district to also introduce a bill that would work towards thinking about the credits issue. But Kate has really helped us out in shepherding that along, as she's done for folks in a number of jurisdictions. So hopefully, again, we'll see this kind of wider understanding of this issue, and see more folks across the country pursuing legislation in order to make it a reality for young people.
Yeah, thank you so much for all of your thoughts on that. I'd like to end on just one more question that expands on this notion that education, of course, continues across settings, whether you are in detention or not. So thinking more broadly, I'd love to hear just briefly from each of you all, what does education that honors youth and community look like to you? What should we be working toward? If anyone wants to start off.
Real coping skills. I feel like that's a very important real coping skills that you're really gonna need in real life. You know, like it's good about to learn about science and like history and all that, but like I feel like to manage like finance and like budgeting and just stuff like that to really prepare them, I think that's the best way to do it.
Thank you. Go ahead, Theo.
Yeah, I would just like to see continuity in education. You know, it's not enough for a young person to enter a facility and then the sending school send a work packet via fax. You know, if this pandemic has done anything positive, at least in education, it has, you know, helped us understand how to utilize technology in a way that helps students gain access to curriculum in a really meaningful way. And the technology has kind of helped bridge a divide that, you know, we've never really known quite how to deal with in times prior, but now we have that technology. And I would just hope to see, you know, real continuity in the way that schools use it with the secure facilities to just help ensure that young people aren't missing out on valuable days of education when they don't have to.
I think that schools in the community should have the resources and the supports that they can support young people themselves without having to push students out and turn to a totally other system that is punitive and harmful.
Thank you all. This has been such a engaging and interesting discussion for me, and really has me thinking about how we can think about education in incarceration as, you know, fully connected to educating the whole child, and, you know, bringing more enriching programming and really just wrapping around support for all kids, whether they are incarcerated or not. I really appreciate you all being with us. This has been Teo Belle from the School Justice Project, Kate Burdick from the Juvenile Law Center, and Oswaldo Lira from Arts for Healing and Justice Network. Thank you to everyone in our audience. It has been really great being with you here left. And I'm going to pass it back to Patty.
Thank you, Stephanie, and thank you to our panel. This has been Freedom to Learn, Education Reform as part of the Youth Decarceration Movement, presented by the National Center for Youth Law. We want to extend special thanks to our event sponsors, Kravith, Latham & Watkins, LLP, and O'Melveny. This concludes our event. Thank you.